In the fading light of a late autumn afternoon in 1868, as smoke curled above the burning castles of Azu, a lone figure cut through the chaos like a streak of lightning. She wore no armor made of steel, only layers of cloth wrapped tightly around her body to keep her movements fast and fluid. Her long black hair was tied back, but strands had escaped and clung to her blood-streaked face. In her hands, she held a naginata, a long, curved blade that shimmered in the setting sun. With each step she took, enemies fell, stunned by the impossible sight before them, a young woman, not yet 24, fighting with the fury of an entire army. Her name was Nakano Takiko, and on that day she fought not for glory, not for honor, but for the homeland she loved, a land that was being torn apart as Japan entered its most violent transformation. While samurai men battled under banners and official ranks, she and dozens of other women had chosen to fight in the shadows. Forbidden by tradition yet driven by a courage that refused to be quiet. But history, as it is often told, tends to remember those in power. It remembers emperors, generals, and diplomats. It remembers the victories of men and the tragedies they left behind. What it almost never remembers are the women whose bravery equaled, and sometimes surpassed, that of the greatest warriors. Nakano Takiko is one of those forgotten names, a woman whose story was so extraordinary, so impossible for her time, that later generations would struggle to believe she ever existed. Yet she did. Her life was short, fierce, and dramatic, shaped by a childhood filled with discipline, a country on the edge of collapse, and a determination that refused to accept the limits society placed upon her. And though she died young, her final act on the battlefield would echo through centuries, carried quietly by the people of Azu until the modern world rediscovered her and realized that history had overlooked a heroine. This video will take you back to a Japan caught between two worlds, the old era of samurai loyalty and the new era of national unity under the Meiji government. It was a time of betrayal, rebellion, and desperate fighting, where entire families took up arms to defend their homes. In this turbulent landscape, Nakano Takiko forged her identity. She was not born into privilege. She did not inherit a famous family name. Instead, she carved her place into the fabric of history with nothing more than skill, intelligence, and a spirit that refused to break. But before we explore the battles, the legends, and the heartbreaking end that secured her place in folklore, we must understand the world she lived in, a world where women were expected to remain quiet observers of history, not active participants. And yet, despite every barrier, Nakano Takiko did more than participate. She led. She commanded a unit of women known as the Joshitai, a group that would defy the expectations of an entire nation and prove that courage has no gender. Why, then, is her name absent from most history books? Why does the world know the stories of male samurai, Miyamoto Musashi, Oda Nobunaga, Tokugawa Ieyasu, but almost nothing of the woman who led the final charge of the Azu forces during the Boshin War? The answer lies in the politics of storytelling. After the Meiji Restoration, Japan sought to present itself as a modern nation rooted in strict gender roles. A tale of women warriors did not fit this new image. And so the story faded, kept alive only in Azu, where families whispered her name during festivals and placed flowers at the site where she fell. Today, more than 150 years later, her story is finally coming to light. And you are about to discover why Nakano Takiko was not just a female warrior, but one of the last true samurai, whose courage rivaled the greatest heroes of Japan's past. Her life is a reminder that legends are not always born in the pages of history books. Sometimes, they are hidden in the margins, waiting for someone to go back, read closely, and bring them into the light. Nakano Takiko was not destined for an ordinary life. From the moment she entered the world in 1847, during the final decades of the Edo period, Japan was a country poised on the edge of monumental change. Yet in her quiet corner of Aizu, surrounded by mountains and rice fields, the young girl grew up in an environment that valued discipline, loyalty, and education. Her childhood was marked not by privilege, but by an unshakable curiosity, one that would soon lead her down a path few women were ever allowed to walk. She was the eldest daughter in a family that, though not wealthy, believed deeply in tradition and learning. While most girls her age learned sewing, etiquette, and the skills needed to become good wives, Takiko was drawn to the sound of clashing wooden swords and the shouts of martial training from the dojos nearby. She watched the boys practice their kata, memorizing each movement with an intensity that startled even her parents. There was something different about her, an inner fire, a restless energy that pushed her to challenge every boundary placed in her way. Her parents, sensing that their daughter's spirit could not be confined to the usual path, allowed her to study more than what society typically permitted. She learned classical literature, Chinese philosophy, and the moral code of the samurai. But what truly set her destiny in motion was the arrival of a remarkable teacher, Akaoka Daisuke, a scholar and martial artist whose influence would shape her entire life. Akaoka saw in Takiko not just intelligence, but a strength of character rarely found in men, let alone young girls. He took her under his wing, teaching her not only combat techniques, but the deeper meaning behind them. With him, she learned the naginata, the long pole weapon that would one day define her legend. The weapon suited her perfectly. Its sweeping arcs matched the fluid precision of her movements, and its elegance reflected the grace she carried even in the heat of battle. Yet the naginata was more than just a weapon. For centuries, it had been the traditional tool of Anabu-geisha, the female warriors of earlier Japan. Though by Takiko's time the role of female fighters had largely disappeared, the spirit of those forgotten women resonated deeply within her. As she trained, she felt connected to a lineage that history had nearly erased, as if their strength flowed through her hands every time she gripped the wooden practice pole. Her days became a cycle of discipline and learning. At dawn, she practiced forms in the courtyard until sweat coated her skin and her arms trembled from effort. In the afternoons, she studied philosophy, poetry, military texts, and Confucian classics. At night, she copied lessons by candlelight, refusing to let exhaustion dull her hunger for knowledge. The people around her whispered that she was unusual, gifted, perhaps even too bold for her own good. But no one, not even she, knew that this relentless preparation would one day push her into the heart of a war that would define her destiny. As she grew older, her confidence sharpened. She became known for her sharp mind, her courage, and her unwavering sense of justice. But these qualities, admired by those who knew her personally, also set her apart in a society where women were expected to be quiet and compliant. Tradition dictated that she should marry, raise children, and support a household. Yet Takiko felt no pull toward that life. She dreamed of something different, something undefined but powerful, a purpose she could feel in her bones but could not yet name. Akaoka Daisuke recognized that she was destined for more than a conventional path. He pushed her harder, trained her with a seriousness reserved for warriors, and taught her lessons about honor, sacrifice, and integrity. Their teacher-student bond deepened into something that shaped her worldview. She learned that being a warrior was not about wielding a weapon, but about carrying a responsibility to protect, to endure, to stand for what is right even when the world demanded silence. By the time she reached adulthood, Nakano Takiko had become a woman unlike any in Aizu. Strong, educated, and fiercely disciplined, she carried the quiet strength of someone built for turbulent times. And those times were coming. The world outside Aizu was changing rapidly, and the political storms gathering across Japan would soon pull her into a conflict that would test every lesson she had ever learned. Her childhood had forged the steel of her spirit. The years ahead would determine how brightly it would shine, or how tragically it would be extinguished. By the time Nakano Takiko entered her early 20s, Japan was no longer the stable world she had known as a child. The country was trembling under the weight of a political transformation unlike anything in its long history. For more than 250 years, the Tokugawa shogunate had ruled the nation with strict order, isolating Japan from much of the outside world. But when the black ships of the West appeared on Japanese shores and demanded trade, the foundation of that long-standing peace began to crumble. Ideas of modernity, nationalism, and reform flooded into the country, bringing with them conflict and division. The once powerful shogunate weakened, and a movement rose to restore authority to the emperor. As tensions escalated, the nation split into two camps: those who supported the Tokugawa and those who championed the new era of imperial rule. What began as political debate soon escalated into open warfare. Aizu, the domain where Takiko lived, became one of the central strongholds of Tokugawa loyalty. The people of Aizu were renowned for their discipline, honor, and unwavering sense of duty. Even among the samurai class, they were known for their intense commitment to the warrior code. To them, pledging loyalty was not a political choice, but an unbreakable moral bond. And so, when the empire demanded their surrender, Aizu refused. Their resistance placed them directly in the crosshairs of the newly formed imperial army, an army far larger, better equipped, and increasingly influenced by Western weapons and tactics. As the conflict deepened, Takiko watched her world drift closer to chaos. Martial drills intensified. Castle walls were reinforced. Messenger after messenger arrived bearing news of battles won and lost across the country. And all the while, fear began to seep into the cracks of daily life. Families whispered about the coming storm. Mothers prepared emergency stores of food. Fathers sharpened swords that had not been drawn in generations. The air was thick with anxiety, but beneath it was a stronger emotion, a fierce determination to defend Aizu at any cost. Takiko felt that determination as sharply as she felt the weight of the naginata in her hands. She had trained for years, pushing herself far beyond the expectations of her gender, but now she faced the reality that society still refused to acknowledge her strength. Women were expected to remain inside the walls, to support the war effort from behind the scenes, cooking, sewing, tending to the wounded. Even though Takiko was more skilled than many of the young male soldiers preparing for battle, she was told that war was not her place. The battlefield, they insisted, was for men. But Takiko could not accept that. She had not spent years forging herself into a warrior just to stand by while her home was threatened. She felt every vibration of the political tension as if it were a personal battle within her own soul. Her teacher, Akoka Daisuke, understood this internal struggle. He knew that her heart longed to fight, but he also knew that the social world around them was not ready for a woman like her. He tried to protect her, urging patience, reminding her that rash action could cost her everything. Yet even he could see that the tide of history was moving in ways no one could stop. When news came of the shogunate's defeat in Kyoto and the rapid advance of imperial forces, the people of Aizu realized that the war was no longer a distant threat. It was coming directly toward them. Villages emptied as young men marched toward the front lines. Families said hurried goodbyes, unsure if they would ever meet again. The skies over Azu grew darker, not from the weather, but from the looming sense of doom. And through all of this, Takiko felt her resolve sharpen. She understood that waiting behind walls would not save anyone. If Azu fell, it would fall with or without her blade. But if she stepped forward, if she took her place on the battlefield, perhaps her courage could make a difference. Japan was transforming with brutal speed, ripping apart the old order to build something new. And in the middle of this storm stood a woman who refused to let the world define her limitations. The war was coming. The choices were narrowing. And Nakano Takiko was about to make the decision that would shape her legacy forever. The road to war was no longer just a path for the nation. It was the path that would lead her directly into history. As the Imperial Army closed in on Azu, the sound of gunfire and cannon blasts echoed across the region like a thunder that refused to stop. Fear spread through the streets, but so did a quiet, steely resolve. Families prepared for the worst, knowing that surrender was not an option for a clan whose loyalty had defined its identity for centuries. Amid this tension, young men trained relentlessly, but they were not the only ones preparing for battle. Hidden behind the walls of homes, temples, and schools, another force was quietly gathering strength, one that no strategist could have predicted, and no tradition could fully contain. It began with whispers. A few women, strong, determined, and frustrated with being told to stay behind, approached Nakano Takiko. They had heard of her skill, her devotion, her courage. They knew she had trained with the Naginata for years under Akaoka Daisuke. And they, too, felt the fire of Azu's impending downfall burning in their chests. These women were daughters of samurai, wives of soldiers, sisters of men preparing to die. They had lived their entire lives under a code of honor, yet in the moment of their domain's greatest need, they were expected to retreat to the shadows. It was a contradiction they could no longer accept. At first, Takiko hesitated, not because she doubted her abilities, but because she understood the consequences. The government did not recognize female soldiers. The military did not accept women on the battlefield. To fight would mean breaking social boundaries so deeply ingrained that even victory would not guarantee respect. But as the days passed, and the roar of war grew louder, she realized that the choice was not truly hers. She had been forged for this moment, and these women looked to her because somehow they already believed she could lead them. And so, quietly, without official permission or announcement, the Joshitai was born, an all-female fighting unit unlike anything Japan had seen in centuries. They trained in secret, meeting in secluded courtyards and forest clearings at dawn. Their weapons were simple, naginata, short swords, and whatever they could find. Their only armor was layers of cloth, and the unyielding conviction that they would protect their home or die trying. And at the center of this small but fierce group stood Nakano Takiko, guiding their movements, correcting their stances, pushing them to become warriors in both body and spirit. The Joshitai was a force of contradictions, young women who moved with elegance yet struck with deadly precision, warriors who were expected to be silent yet carried voices full of defiance, individuals who had been denied a place in war yet chose to walk directly into its heart. Some were barely in their teens. Others were mothers who had left children behind, knowing they might never return. All shared the same determination. If Azu was to fall, it would not fall without their resistance. As their numbers grew, whispers turned into rumors, and rumors into astonished conversations among the men. Tales of women training with the ferocity of seasoned fighters traveled quickly. Some soldiers admired them. Others scoffed and said they were foolish. Yet when they saw Takiko's calm discipline, her mastery of the naginata, and the unity she inspired among her followers. Even skeptics fell silent. She moved with a quiet confidence that seemed to cut through doubt as sharply as any blade. Still, the government refused to formally recognize them. To the military, they were not soldiers, they were outsiders. But this lack of recognition did not break the Joshitai. In fact, it strengthened their resolve. They would not fight for acknowledgement or reputation. They would fight for Azu, for their families, and for the right to decide their own destiny in a world that had never made space for women like them. As battle drew near, Takiko stood before her unit, looking at the determined faces illuminated by torchlight. She knew that the days ahead would demand everything from them, their strength, their courage, and perhaps even their lives. Yet she felt no fear. Instead, she felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. This small, secret army of women had committed themselves to a path from which there was no return. In their eyes she saw something she had never seen in all her years of training, a shared belief that their actions, though unrecognized by history or society, mattered deeply. And in that moment, Nakano Takiko understood that the Joshitai were not just warriors. They were a symbol of rebellion, of resilience, and of the unspoken truth that courage does not follow rules written by men. The world was changing, and these women were determined to carve their place within it, armed not only with weapons, but with a conviction powerful enough to challenge centuries of tradition. Their time had come. The Battle of Azu was approaching, and the Joshitai would be ready. By the early days of October 1868, the skies above Azu were thick with smoke, the kind that clung to the skin and seeped into the lungs like a warning from the gods. The Imperial Army had arrived in full force. Thousands of soldiers armed with rifles, cannons, and Western-style tactics that dwarfed the traditional weapons of the samurai. From every direction, the thunder of artillery hammered against the castle walls. Buildings crumbled. Flames devoured homes. The world Takiko had known since childhood was disappearing in front of her eyes. Yet amid the devastation, a different fire burned, one fueled by defiance rather than destruction. The Joshitai stood at the northern edge of the battlefield, their Naginata blades glinting in the smoky light as they prepared to do what no official army had allowed them to do: fight. There was no ceremony, no speech, no formal blessing. Only the sound of their breath steadying, the rustle of cloth armor being tightened, and the unspoken understanding that this day might claim all of their lives. Nakano Takiko stood at the front, calm and poised, her hands gripping the familiar weight of her weapon. She knew that the moment she stepped forward, she would cross a line that could never be uncrossed. The first charge began not with a declaration, but with a roar. A group of Imperial soldiers spotted the Joshitai and rushed toward them, expecting an easy victory over a band of women who, in their eyes, had no place on the battlefield. But they were not ready for what awaited them. In a single, fluid motion, Takiko lunged. Her Naginata sliced through the air in a wide arc, its blade finding its mark with devastating precision. One soldier fell, then another. Her movements were swift, disciplined, almost graceful. Panic spread among the Imperial ranks as they realized the truth. These women were not a symbolic gesture of desperation. They were fighters, real, trained, and terrifyingly determined. The Joshitai moved with her like an extension of her own will. They struck with the unity of a single body, cutting through enemy lines with surprising effectiveness. Their Naginata allowed them to maintain distance, sweeping the battlefield in relentless waves. For a brief, breathtaking moment, it seemed as if the impossible was happening. The women of Azu were pushing back an army that believed it could crush them without effort. But war is not a story that rewards courage alone. As the fighting intensified, the Imperial soldiers regrouped, bringing in riflemen who formed tight lines behind cover. Takiko sensed the shift. The air itself seemed to change. She knew that the Naginata's reach, so effective in close combat, offered little defense against bullets. Still, she refused to retreat. Her voice cut through the chaos, urging her women forward, not with fear but with resolve. They charged again, screaming the name of Azu with a ferocity that shook their enemies. Then, in the midst of the battle's crescendo, it happened. A crack of gunfire sliced through the noise. Takiko felt a sudden, sharp impact in her chest, like a hammer smashing into her ribcage. She stumbled, her breath catching, her vision blurring at the edges. The world around her seemed to slow. She looked down and saw the blossom of blood spreading across her kimono. But even as the life began to drain from her body, she refused to fall. She stood upright, clutching her naginata, determined not to give the Imperial soldiers the satisfaction of seeing her collapse in fear. But she knew what had to be done. Dying on the battlefield was an honor, but being captured after death, having her body desecrated by the enemy, was a fate she could not allow. Summoning the last of her strength, she called out to her younger sister Yuko, who fought close by. Her voice was strained but unwavering as she gave the command that would forever define her legend, to sever her head and take it away to safety before the enemy could claim it. Yuko's hands trembled, but she obeyed. With tears streaming down her face, she carried out her sister's final request, then fled with the head cradled against her chest, running through the chaos until she found a quiet temple where she could bury it. There, beneath a pine tree, she laid her sister to rest, far from the reach of the enemy, preserved with dignity. With their leader gone, the Joshitai fought on, driven not by hope but by devotion. They knew the battle was lost, yet they refused to surrender. One by one, they fell, not as forgotten casualties, but as warriors who chose to defy the world that denied their place in history. And as the fires consumed Azu, Nakano Takiko's final stand became more than just a moment in a war. It became a symbol of courage, of resistance, and of a woman who fought not because she was allowed to, but because she believed it was her duty. The legacy of the Enigma Codebreakers extends far beyond the walls of Bletchley Park or the battlefields of World War II, shaping not only the outcome of the war, but the very foundations of our modern digital world in ways that most people never realize. When historians estimate that the intelligence produced by code-breaking shortened the war in Europe by at least 2 years and saved millions of lives, it becomes clear that the quiet work of these cryptanalysts carried weight equal to that of entire armies. Their contributions, once wrapped in secrecy for decades, fundamentally altered how nations perceive intelligence, technology, and the silent battles fought in the shadows. Beyond the immediate wartime impact, the breakthroughs developed to crack Enigma, particularly the use of early electromechanical computing, became stepping stones for the creation of modern computers. Alan Turing's theoretical models of computation, the very ones that guided his approach to breaking Enigma, eventually evolved into the conceptual basis for all digital machines, from the smartphone in our pockets to the supercomputers that power scientific discovery. Yet Turing himself suffered a tragic fate, facing persecution for his sexuality despite being one of the pivotal figures responsible for the Allied victory. His later exoneration and public recognition serve as reminders of both the brilliance and the vulnerability of the individuals behind such monumental achievements. The legacy also lives on in the post-war global intelligence community, where signals intelligence became a permanent pillar of national defense. Organizations such as GCHQ and the NSA were built directly on the foundations laid during the Enigma project, adopting the philosophy that information, intercepted, decoded, and understood, could be as decisive as tanks or bombers. This shift reshaped warfare into a domain not only of physical confrontation, but of invisible competition across radio waves, wires, and eventually digital networks. The ethical questions raised by such capabilities, such as the balance between security and privacy, can also trace their origins to the unprecedented power wielded by the Codebreakers at Bletchley Park. Their work proved the immense potential of intelligence, but also the responsibility it demands. Today, the Enigma story continues to fascinate because it captures the perfect intersection of human ingenuity, sacrifice, and the relentless pursuit of truth. Hidden beneath layers of complexity, museums and films have brought renewed attention to the men and women who work tirelessly behind locked doors, often without recognition or even the ability to tell loved ones what they were doing. Their heroism, rooted in patience rather than glory, stands as a testament to the idea that history is often shaped not just by generals and leaders, but by quiet minds working in obscurity. The continued study of Enigma also serves as a powerful reminder. Behind every moment of peace or victory lies a vast network of unsung efforts, and the stories of those who contributed from the shadows deserve to be brought into the light.